This video is all about which Sony cameras are the best for sports photography, also action, performance photography, anything where the subject is moving. We're going to start with the APS-C cameras first because they are very capable at shooting sports action. Most of the reason is that they have very good autofocus, and they also can shoot at 11 frames per second. Well, almost. We'll get into that later. The very first camera I would mention that's really good at sports is the A6000. It's the venerable, 2014. It's 10 years old, still extremely capable, really cheap to buy used. If you're looking for absolute entry level and you don't have a lot of dough, A6000 is your friend. The A6300 is an improved version of the A6000. It's the same sensor, but it's much improved in the way that the image was processed off of that sensor. Same thing with the A6400 and the A6500, and eventually the A6100. Now the caveat to these, they're advertised as 11 frames per second in mechanical shutter, which is what they have. However, if you read the fine print, if you're in live view, meaning you're looking through the viewfinder and you're in live view, it's actually 8 frames per second. It's only 11 frames per second if you're not in live view. So a little weird there, but they do a great job and they're really, really fast. Of the APS-C cameras that are really, really good for sports photography, the very best ones are the A6600, which also has the 8:11 problem, so that if you're in live view and you're looking through the viewfinder as you're shooting sports, you're at 8 frames per second. It sounds really fast, but it's actually only 8. If you turn live view off, you're going to be at 11 frames per second. And the big kingpin of the sports photography and APS-C and Sony right now is definitely the A6700, which gives you a full 10 frames per second with live view, like looking through the viewfinder. And more importantly than that even, is the new sensor. So when Sony developed the sensor for the FX30, which I'm actually shooting this video with right now, they thought, well, let's just stick it into a still camera too. It's an excellent, awesome sensor. People love it. One of the big disadvantages of shooting the APS-C sensor cameras is that in low light, they just don't gather as much light as the full frame sensors do. And so while they're excellent and the A6700 is the best of all of them, it's still not as good in low light as a full frame camera. Like for instance, I would rather shoot an A7 III full frame versus an A6700 for extreme low light. Now there's one advantage though that people forget about, and that is that if you're trying to start out in sports photography, the most difficult thing to get is like a really long fast lens, like a 300-2.8 or a 400-2.8. And when you use APS-C on a full frame lens, like the 7200 2.8, you actually get a 100 to 300 2.8 effectively by doing the APS-C. So the big advantage of the APS-C cameras is you don't have to spend as much money on long glass because you get longer by using full frame lenses on it. But the disadvantage is you can't punch in because you're already punched in. So next we're going to move into the full frame cameras. Sony has made a lot of them, a whole bunch of them since 2008 or 9. We are only going to be talking about the benchmark is the A7 III. The A7 II was really not appropriate for shooting sports. The autofocus system was nowhere near ready. And I'm pretty sure that camera only shot 5 frames per second. So it just is not really possible to do a sports, maybe a remote or something like that. But the A7 III is the best deal there is in sports photography. It shoots a real 10 frames per second. And the most important thing about it maybe is that it's got a Z battery. So the battery that was designed for the A9 got put into every subsequent camera that came out after the A9 in 2017. And so the A7 III got the big battery, which lasts forever. It's a great battery. It has excellent autofocus for sports photography. And the other thing that people forget about, the A7 III was the first A7 series camera to get a USB-C port, which is really important because you don't have to have an external battery charger to charge your battery. You can literally just plug it into a cell phone outlet with a USB brick and off you go. You can also just have that tip in your car, and as you're driving to and from assignments, you can be charging your camera. So it's extremely useful, and every camera after the A7 III has the USB-C port. It's so important. When I travel on my motorcycle, which I'll be doing this week, I'll be out in Arizona and Colorado, I take an A7C Mark II because of its tiny size, but it's got that USB-C port, so I only bring one battery, and I just plug it in the hotel when I crash at night. So anyway, so the A7C camera shares the same sensor as the A7 III. So everything about the sensor and the way it works is the same in the A7C, except you lose the 2-card capability and you go down to 1 SD card. But otherwise, the A7C is a very capable camera. It's excellent, good for sports, all that stuff. The next camera I'm going to talk about is really maybe the most important one, and that's the A7 IV, which is a 32 megapixel camera that shoots 10 frames per second, has the Z battery, and has fantastic autofocus and a new sensor. The sensor in that camera was brand new, and it's not the same one that was in the A7 III or the A7C. So the A7 IV is really the best value of any camera you could buy in Sony, in my opinion, because it gives you a very, very large megapixel. It gives you a big file. It gives you 10-bit video if you shoot video. It gives you 10 frames per second with great autofocus, tracking autofocus and all that stuff. It's a fine, fine camera, and it's a full-size camera that can use a grip, which is very important for sports photography, especially if you have big hands and use larger lenses. But you must use all these A7 cameras in mechanical shutter. I should have mentioned that first. So A7 III, A7C, A7 IV, you've got to use mechanical shutter. If you're in silent shutter, you're going to have all kinds of warpage, and it's just not going to work. They're terrible. So you've got to be in mechanical. If you're in mechanical, though, you're good to go to shoot sports, no problem. The A7C Mark II, which is my favorite camera, I use that camera for every single assignment I get except for sports. Portrait jobs, photojournalism. It's great because it's super small, it's lightweight, I love it. One disadvantage of the A7C Mark II is the VVF is not as good as the A7 IV. It's slightly lower in terms of its resolution, and it only has 1 card outlet. So if you are a 2-card shooter and you've got to do that, I don't, but if you have to have that, the A7 IV is the better way to go. But I love the A7C Mark II. It's my current favorite camera. Next, we're going to talk about the A7R III, which is the big file camera. R stands for resolution in Sony's setup. So it can shoot 10 frames per second. It's a 42 megapixel, has the Z battery, has much better EVF, high resolution EVF. And this camera actually is quite good at shooting sports and allows you to punch in and still have a pretty big file left over after you've done it. The A7R IV is 10 frames per second, 61 megapixel, even bigger sensor, Z battery, but the autofocus is not that good. I think that the A7R III autofocus was better than the A7R IV, which is extremely unusual in Sony because they always improve everything as they go forward, but I never liked the A7R IV for autofocus. It's just not appropriate for sports, but I included it anyway. The A7R V is a 10 frame per second, 61 megapixel, great in low light. This is the camera that they sort of figured out how to make a huge sensor and make it really good in low light at the same time. The A7R V is a fantastic camera, but remember, you must be in mechanical shutter to shoot sports. You cannot do it. It's the worst offender that Sony has made so far in electronic shutter for jello effect and all that stuff. The A7CR shares the same exact sensor as the A7R V. However, it can't shoot 10 frames per second. It can only do 8 frames per second in tracking autofocus. So A7CR is not really appropriate for shooting sports. It's just too slow, but it's 61 megapixel, it's tiny, has 1 card and a great EVF. But if you shoot sports like 20% of the time and you shoot landscape the rest of the time, maybe. But I think you'd still be better off with A7C-R. I'm going to mention one last camera that might surprise people, and that is the A7S Mark III. This is a 12 megapixel camera, and you think, 12 megapixel? Geez, man, that's not cool. It's actually very cool. The A7S Mark III is the low light king. Nothing touches that camera, even A9 III, A9 II, A1, nothing comes close. So if you shoot in no light every week, you know, during your season, whatever you're shooting, especially if you're indoor sports, if you shoot volleyball in a real pit. Last, I'm going to talk about the 4 cameras that really are designed specifically for shooting sports. And these are the cameras that I use all the time for sporting events. In order of how they were manufactured, the A9 came out in March of 2017. It is a 20 frame per second camera, 24 megapixel. It is an amazing camera. The autofocus on this camera is better than all of the cameras that we just mentioned prior in this video. The A9 autofocus is awesome. It is so good, and it's really good in low light. It's really good backlit. Doesn't matter where you take this camera, it's going to focus awesome. Now, the one caveat with this camera that's not great is that it does not have an anti-flicker possibility. So when you go out to a field that has, you know, when you're shooting a DSLR in the old days and it was a green frame and a blue frame and a warm frame and a white frame, that's where you need anti-flicker. The A9 doesn't have it at all. So it's a real nightmare if you shoot a lot of sports. If you're a traveling photographer and you're going to like different games all over the place, all over your county or whatever, if you're shooting high school, and a lot of them have flicker in the lighting, A9 is not going to help you very much. Now, when they came out with the A9 II, they allowed you to do anti-flicker in that camera. But again, there's a caveat there. When you want anti-flicker, you have to leave electronic shutter and you have to go to mechanical shutter. The maximum frame per second in mechanical shutter on the A9 II is 10 frames per second. However, when you're using anti-flicker, the camera, each time you're shooting a frame, it's actually adjusting forward or backward to get the peak of the pulse of the lights. So you might be at 8 frames per second, you might be at 9.5, but you're probably not going to be at 10 frames per second on the A9 II. So when you lose the ability to do 20 frames per second altogether when you want to do anti-flicker on the A9 II. When the A1 came out, it was a miracle camera in many respects. Just staying on that anti-flicker point, the A1 can shoot anti-flicker at 30 frames per second on electronic shutter. It was a miracle. So the Alpha 1 is an unbelievable camera. It increased the frame rate to 30 frames per second from 20 from the A9 series. The anti-flicker is fantastic. The thing that is so important to remember about the Alpha 1 is it's the best camera Sony makes, inclusive of the A9 III, for punching in. So if you only have a 300-2.8, for instance, and you shoot a lot of baseball, the Alpha 1 is your friend because you can punch in and you still get a 21 megapixel file when you go to APS-C and you zoom in on sensor. So the Alpha 1, in my estimation, is the best sports camera that Sony makes, bar none. Nothing is as good as that camera. It's just absolutely, it does everything well. And even on the sync side, the flash sync, you can sync regular flash, like studio flashes or arena strobes at 400th of a second, which is pretty remarkable. Now it's expensive, you know, $6,500, but, and a lot of people complain about firmware updates in this camera, and there have been some hiccups there, but the camera is fantastic the way it came out of the box when it was designed and manufactured and delivered to my door. So that camera is fantastic. I love the A1. The last camera we're going to talk about is the A9 Mark III, which is kind of a George Jetson camera, if you will. It does everything well. It's a 24.6 megapixel sensor, slightly larger than the A9 and A9 II. It doesn't need anti-flicker because it's a global shutter. So if you have banding from LED lighting, or some weird fluorescent fixture where you shoot, there's no issue. You just power through whatever you want, and there's no artifacts whatsoever. You can shoot up to 120 frames per second. And again, you don't have to, there's no switch to throw to do anti-flicker. There's no switch to throw to be able to shoot in banding lighting. It just works. It just works killer. The flash sync speed, you can sync flash at any shutter speed, which is crazy. If you can afford it, it's $6,000. It's the best sports camera there is. I would also say that in the same way that the A9 is better than all APS-C and all A7 series cameras, bar none, it's like so far ahead of the game. The A9 Mark III is better than the A1 and both A9s. It is just smokes everything. So the autofocus accuracy and speed, especially when paired with the new 300-2.8, it is just wicked fast. I mean, it's just otherworldly quick and accurate. So the A9 III is the very best camera that Sony makes for sports photography, performance, any kind of action. But there are a lot of things to choose from. So bottom line is, if you're on a budget, the APS-C cameras, especially the A6700, is the best camera in that realm. In the A7 series, the best camera to me for shooting sports is the A7 IV with its 32 megapixel sensor, Z battery, great AF, all that stuff. But man, if you're really serious about sports, you don't have a lot of dough. The A9, you can pick up a used one for, around $1,200, $1,300. That is a fantastic camera. By the way, if you shoot only outdoors under light and you don't shoot under lights at all, the A9 is a great camera. It's fantastic. If you've got the money and you shoot like a lot of stuff, a lot of sports, the A1 is kind of my favorite of all of them because it does everything well. I do food photography with the A1 because of its 50 megapixel sensor. It's a huge sensor. I don't find any need to own an R series camera because I have two Alpha 1s, because I just don't see the difference is really worth it. So, but on top is the king, the A9 III. So I hope this helps you. I'm really good at answering questions if I can. So please use the comment section below to, ask me questions about these. I will put some affiliate links in for my favorite cameras that shoot sports. I'd love for you to use them because it helps me kind of continue to do content like this. But yeah, hit me with questions, comments, whatever. If I made a mistake, let me know. I'll own up to it if I did. I do make mistakes. But thanks so much for watching. Come on back for more.